Okay, on to this afternoon's programme. Programme is entitled For Honour's Sake, Jews in the British Armed Forces since 1745. Excuse me. This was originally going to be a joint effort by Dan Fox and Louis Trupp. Unfortunately, due to the lockdown and the involvement of the armed forces in all this activity, Louis has had to go off and do his duty elsewhere. So we're delighted to welcome Dan here this afternoon. And I'm just going to read from our newsletter just a description of what Dan is going to be talking about this afternoon. A look at our community's services to the Crown from the Jacobite Rebellion to the current day, including the lives of Jewish soldiers, sailors, airmen, airwomen and officers. Dan Fox himself joined the Army Reserve in September 2006 and was mobilised into the regular army for a year in July 2009, which included a 6-month operational tour of Afghanistan. As a reservist, he serves at least 30 days a year in uniform alongside his day job. Dan is currently Deputy National Chairman of Ajax JMA. Okay, Dan, over to you. We're in your hands.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me, and thank everyone for attending this afternoon. I might not have been speaking to you as a Jewish serviceman at all, had it not been for the lifting in 1828 of laws which had prevented anybody who had not taken communion in the Church of England from taking up various forms of public employment, including military service. The laws have been introduced originally to exclude Catholics, but they'd also affected Jews and members of other faiths as well. That said, the century and a half or so for which those laws stood was some of the most bellicose in European history, and including the last pitched battles on these islands, and nobody remained really uninvolved. In 1745, Bonnie Prince Charlie sent his Jacobite troops into England for their third and final rebellion. A corps was raised to defend London, led by the Grenadier Guards, and a handful of Jews from the community based in and around the Bevis Mark Synagogue in Aldgate joined up. The corps gathered. It assembled at Tottenham Court Road, a moment captured by William Hogarth in a satirical painting 5 years later. And from there it manoeuvred to the location chosen for the defence of London, an area of common ground and cleared woodland in Middlesex, close to the main routes in from the north, called Finchley, a moment captured in the name that Hogarth gave his painting. Now, in the end, the Jacobites got no further south than Derby, and the defence of London became unnecessary. But I still love the idea that the first Jews to really make their presence felt in Finchley were a handful of volunteer soldiers, about 250 years before the rest of us turned up. History does not record whether they returned to Aldgate with news of house prices and the state of the local schools. Between 1756 and 1763, Britain, along with the other great European powers, fought the 7 Years' War across the globe, a conflict so significant that some historians today even refer to it as World War Zero. And the most significant turning point in that war was the Battle for Quebec in 1759, when the French were defeated by the British, and the British were able to assert their dominance over North America and much of the rest of the world. Leading the naval assault that day was Captain Alexander Schomburg of the Royal Navy. Now, he'd converted to C of E while at school, but we're still going to claim him. He was the son of German Jewish immigrants, his father doctor. Schomburg's sons also went on to serve in the Royal Navy, fighting in the Napoleonic Wars at the beginning of the 19th century. And with that time, no less peaceable than the century that preceded it, and with those restrictive laws lifted, Jews were able to play their full part in the services, and indeed they did. By the end of the 19th century, at the turn of the 20th, in the Boer War, there were 3,000 Jews who served in that, 127 paying the ultimate price. And in the decade before, there were so many Jewish sailors and soldiers that the case was successfully put for a Jewish military chaplaincy to be established in the garrison town of Aldershot. And just over 20 years later, the first British Jewish military rabbis deployed to the field for the first time at the beginning of the First World War. And it's in the First World War that we really see distinct and discrete Jewish identity forming within the British Armed Forces. Community organisations, rabbis in their sermons, and the Jewish Chronicle urged Jews to sign up. This recruitment poster from 1914 even envisaging the creation of a specific Jewish unit. The same or similar slogan was emblazoned on the front of the Jewish Chronicle offices. Jews in Canada were urged to sign up in the same way, with posters in both Yiddish and English, featuring the celebrity endorsements of the first 3 Jews to have served, or practicing Jews to have served in the British cabinet: Herbert Samuel, Rufus Isaacs, and Edwin Montague. This led to the creation of the Jewish Draft Reinforcement Company, commanded by Captain Isidore Friedman, a Glaswegian Jew who'd moved to Canada to work in the diamond trade. Overall, 55,000 British and Empire Jews served in World War I, collecting 5 Victoria Crosses, with 2,000 paying the ultimate price. But the picture which sums up the Jewish involvement best for me is this one. It was sent in to Ajax a couple of years ago by the daughter of this man at the top here, Arnold Dunn, annotated simply as Daddy. It's a bit blurred and faded, I know. But we don't know too much more about it. We can tell from their distinctive uniforms that they were members of the Royal Flying Corps, the Inca RAF. And we also know that they're Jewish because they left us at the front of their gathering this day in about 1916, we think, a chalkboard caption at the front declaring themselves simply to be a minion in France. Sounds like a lost Arnold Wesker play. In 1915, the specific Jewish units had come into being. The Jewish or Russian labour companies were so called because they consisted almost entirely of first and second generation immigrants from Eastern Europe. Amongst their duties was digging the trenches ahead of the front line out in France and Belgium. And out in the Middle East, the Zion Mule Corps became the first Jewish fighting unit, fighting under a distinct Jewish insignia, this encircled Magen David, to play an active part in a war since the Bar Kokhba revolt against the Romans 1800 years previously. When the Corps was all but wiped out at Gallipoli, one of its founders, the Zionist leader Zev Jabotinsky, travelled to London to lobby for the establishment of a specific Jewish infantry unit. In 1917, the 38th Battalion, the Royal Fusiliers, was stood up in the East End of London, drawing its membership from the Jewish community there. Because so many of them worked in the schmutter and rag trades, they were nicknamed the King's Own Schneiders. But I prefer their other epithet, the one by which they're still referred to in the Fusiliers Museum in the Tower of London, the Royal Fusiliers. The 39th Battalion was established of Canadian, American, and a handful of Argentinian Jews, and a 40th Battalion was established out in the Yishuv, consisting of Jews in pre-Israel Palestine. That included this man, who you may recognise as one Private David Ben-Gurion. Together, the 3 battalions formed the Jewish Legion, and they served with great distinction out in Palestine, helping to secure key victories against the Ottomans at Megiddo, at the battles of Megiddo and Jerusalem. After the war, they were reduced to 1 battalion size, renamed the First Judeans, and given this distinctive cap badge, the menorah with the slogan Kadima. The badge is today incorporated into the official insignia of the Armed Forces Jewish community. The Jewish contribution to the war went all the way to the top. This is the rather imposing figure of General John Monash, an Australian Jew who was appointed command of the Western Front in April 1918. Monash was a developer and an advocate for the new doctrine of combined arms, bringing together the traditional powers of infantry and cavalry with the new powers of artillery, or better artillery, tanks and airplanes. The doctrine was put to significant, devastating effect at the Battle of Amiens in August 2018. With French, Canadian and British troops taking care of the German flanks, Monash's Australian Corps punched through the enemy's centre. It was the Allies' first significant, meaningful victory of the entire war. Ludendorff, the German joint commander, described it as the blackest day for his troops throughout the entire war. And it led to the 100 Days Offensive, which led to armistice and victory 3 months later. For his efforts, Monash became the first soldier in 200 years and the last since to be knighted in the field. George V himself travelling to the Australian Army headquarters in France to carry out the ceremony. After the war, the community began recognising in many ways the contribution that Jews had made. A book of British jury's honour was published, containing the names of all those who had fought and served, with details of their service, photographs, medals won, and all those sorts of facts and figures about the 55,000 from around the empire that had served. And various veterans organisations sprung up, eventually forming into Ajax in 1928. And the first Ajax parade, of which more later, was held in 1934. Of course, we were then, no more than 5 years later, World War II was upon the world. And again, British Jews and Empire Jews took up the call with 70,000 serving. There were also 31,000 Jews from the Yishuv, about 26,000 served from the beginning, and then towards the end of the war, the Jewish Brigade, which fought in Italy in the last few months of the war, was also established from Jews across the Middle East. Again, the second talk that I give in this series is specifically about Jews and the victory in Europe, which goes into more detail about Jewish service in World War II. That also includes the Special Operations Executive and the Special Intelligence Group. These were, if you like, the clandestine organisations operating behind enemy lines, the SOE in Europe and out in the Pacific Theatre, and the Special Intelligence Group out in North Africa. The more that we've sort of come to know about the operations of these groups, the more we've come to understand that Jews played an incredibly significant, both numerically and in terms of quality, role. The tasks at hand, operating behind enemy lines, with the immigrant and refugee backgrounds, meant that Jews had the local knowledge, the language skills, the cultural knowledge, the cultural experience to operate in these clandestine ways. Out in the Yishuv, 250 Jews were signed up, with 37 eventually deploying with the SOE. Perhaps most famous of those is this woman, Hannah Senesh. Born in Hungary, she'd emigrated to Palestine in 1939, and after joining the SOE, she parachuted into Yugoslavia to make her way to the Hungarian border and start helping in the rescue of Jews bound for Auschwitz. She was arrested there, put on trial by the puppet authorities, and eventually executed for treason. Just before her operation, she wrote a poem which seemed to presage her own downfall. Blessed is the match consumed in kindling flame. Blessed is the flame that burns in the secret fastness of the heart. Blessed is the heart with strength to stop its beating for honour's sake. Blessed is the match consumed in kindling flame. Again, one of indeed the third talk that I give in this series is specifically about Jews and the Special Operations Executive. Again, if that's of interest at a later time. Back in the UK, many immigrant and refugee Jews were originally interned at the beginning of the war as enemy aliens, until it was quite rightly decided that they would be great assets. They were taken from their internment camps and put into alien pioneer companies. And from there, after their training, they were dispersed throughout the rest of the armed forces. About 36 of these alien pioneers ended up as commandos right at the front of the D-Day landing, some of the first boots on the beach, the very tip of the spear of Operation Neptune in June 1944. As the Allies progressed through Europe, the Jewish chaplaincy very much came to the fore in terms of the spiritual and humanitarian response to the liberation of the camps. The Reverend Hardin was a young military rabbi and one of the first people into Bergen-Belsen. Never forgetting what he saw there, he devoted the rest of his life to Shara education until his death in 2008. Of course, as Europe celebrated victory over Nazism, the war in the Pacific continued, almost forgotten, though of course it should never be. and I'll be talking about one Jewish officer's experiences out there a bit later on. Having defeated fascism on the continent, soldiers returned to the UK to find there was a resurgent black shirt movement on the streets of London, Manchester and elsewhere, and it was Ajax and the 43 group, the Jewish veterans group, that led to the street fights against those people. Following the end of World War II, many people remained mobilised for many years afterwards, and of course national service had also begun seeing Jews serve in the various conflicts of the Cold War as well. Since World War II, 11 Jewish servicemen have been killed in action and 49 in training or accidents. That includes Monty Ritterband, killed in Korea, Robert Kunkel, killed during the insurgency in Cyprus, Robert Bankier, one of the first military victims of the official IRA during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And in 1982, Private Jason Burt of Walthamstow was the second youngest British casualty of the Falklands War, dying just 2 days before the end of the conflict, just short of his 18th birthday. May the memories be a blessing. So that's the chain of history, the chain of tradition that myself and my Jewish comrades in the British Armed Forces form our very own little part of nowadays. This is where it started for me as an instructor in the Army Cadet Force. As a kid, I'd never been in any way interested whatsoever in any of the uniformed youth movements. Wasn't the sort of thing that was for me at all. But I was very involved in my Jewish youth movement in Reformed Synagogue Youth, RSY, all the way from a Chanukah as a 9-year-old till my early 20s as one of the Majestic. And around 2005, I wanted to start doing some youth and voluntary work again. One of the options where I was living at the time in Holloway, North London, was an Army Cadet Force unit. So I went along, started volunteering, found myself playing soldiers a couple of nights a week, weekends and on longer camps, and found that I really, really enjoyed it, much to my surprise. It also brought me into the orbit of, really for the first time in my life, both regular and reserve troops. And a couple of, in fact, almost exactly a year later, in September 2006, I joined a reserve military intelligence battalion based in the City of London. Almost exactly 3 years after that, I found myself landing on a troop carrier at Camp Bastion in Northern Helmand, Afghanistan, for a 6-month tour of duty. When I meet other Jews and they find out I'm in the service, there's always two questions. The first is, how many of you are there? Well, there's two organisations that look after Jews, well, three really with Ajax, but the two organisations that look after you, like serving Jews solely at the moment, is the Jewish Committee for Her Majesty's Forces, which is the official body devolved from the MOD to ensure that the administration, especially the religious side, kosher food, the military rabbis, is all taken care of, and is really part of the Royal Army Chaplaincy's department. And then about 15, 20 years ago, a more kind of shop floor social club evolved as well, the Armed Forces Jewish Community. Each year we have a reunion at Amport House down in Hampshire, which is the headquarters of the Royal Army Chaplaincy department. That's for about 50 people. It's also for family and friends, you can see here. And we're also often joined by many members from around the world. This gentleman here, for example, is the Chief Rabbi of the Royal Dutch Navy. This gentleman here is the Deputy Chief Rabbi of the American Army. This guy was an Israeli. He was at Entebbe, and you can see lots of family and friends as well. Those who know the community in the army best, well, between them, these two organisations have got about 300 Jewish people on their books, and there's probably about another 300 that we either don't know about us, we don't know about them, but we're increasingly growing. 600 is probably about right. That would put us in proportion in the armed forces to the same as we are in the general population. A couple of years ago, this man, one of our senior officers, Lieutenant Colonel Danny Sharp of the Royal Army Medical Corps, a doctor, organised a battlefield study tour to Israel and the West Bank. Notice for this went out across the armed forces, with priority to be given to junior ranks who were Jewish and not been to Israel before. This turned up about another 12 or so Jewish comrades that we had not known about previously. Here everyone is at the Commonwealth War Graves in Jerusalem. I'm down at the front there, and also our senior chaplain, Rabbi Reuben Livingston. So it's a growing community. It's a diverse Jewish community, and it's a vibrant one, both in terms of the social side and the religious side as well. Second question I always get is there anti-Semitism? Well, there are certainly anti-Semites. Military reflects society. There are anti-Semites in society. So yes, for me personally, my experience has been one terrible joke said in my presence, and one snide remark, both from so-called comrades who probably didn't realise that I was Jewish. But these are very, very rare. I have had comrades have to deal with more serious incidents, but the point is that these are dealt with. There may have been a time when the army thought that this sort of prejudice, bigotry was all part of serving, that it was a way to build character and build the coherence of a military. But the modern military recognises that these sorts of attitudes, these sorts of behaviours do exactly the opposite. They undermine morale, they undermine coherence, they undermine our ability to operate effectively. So the sorts of policies that the army has to deal with these sorts of things is just as strong as anything you'd find in the rest of the public sector or even the private sector as well. What I can certainly say is that there's no institutional anti-Semitism. All the Jews that I know in the military, whatever service they may be, are frankly thriving, being put forward for all the promotions and training that they're entitled for, and all the honours as well. A couple of years ago, that included this rather dashing fellow, Lieutenant Colonel Mordent Cohen. Originally from Sunderland, he joined up in 1938 after hearing the stories of the Kinder transport children, but he didn't actually serve in Europe. He ended up commanding a West African artillery unit out in Burma. Mordent would talk to his men, who were essentially Nigerian Muslims, about Judaism and Islam's common origins, and they would nickname him the White Ibrahim, the White Abraham. Mordent was determined that the Pacific theatre should not become a forgotten part of World War II, and he devoted his life to educating about it. And in 2019, at the age of 2018 at the age of 101, he received an MBE for his efforts, travelling to the palace to receive it from Her Majesty himself. Mordent left us just short of 102 in March 2019, I think it was, a real captain's innings for his country and for his community. There is one cap badge, there's one unit in the British Army, and one unit only that has two cap badges, the insignia you see on the front of berets and other headwear. That's the Royal Army Chaplains Department, one with a cross for the Christian chaplains and one with a modern David for the Jewish chaplains. At the National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire, the Ajax Memorial to fallen Jewish servicemen and women is one of only two that's there to commemorate those from an ethnic or religious group, the other being for our Sikh comrades. This care, this pride, this safety that the Army provides, the Army, Navy and RAF provides for Jews who are serving, was probably best depicted by an event that took place nearly 3 years ago now at Mervis Marks Synagogue. Here, on this evening, on the 15th of March 2018, our three military rabbis were officially inducted into the chaplaincy by their counterparts in the Royal Navy, the Royal Air Force and the Army, with many guests from the world of politics and the rest of the military there as well. Forces TV was there to capture the evening.
At the oldest synagogue in the UK, a celebration of 350 years of Jewish service to the Crown. Serving personnel joined veterans and members of the Jewish community in London for this first official installation service of three rabbis as armed forces chaplains. Since that first serving chaplain in 1892, Jewish chaplaincy has changed. Rabbis who serve as padres now administer to all faiths and work across the 3 services and cadet force.
It's so meaningful to be able to help to guide the future of our country, the youth, and they really gain so much from the precious time that they spend with the army.
This service was also a way to pay tribute. For Jewish personnel, Torah scrolls are akin to a colour or standard, often carried into battle. These Sifra Torah scrolls were rededicated in memory of 2 former vice presidents of the Jewish Committee for Her Majesty's Forces and carried by current serving personnel.
My ancestors built the synagogue over 300 years ago, and I was raised in this community. My parents went to this place, my cousins, my grandparents, all of that. So not only do I feel that I'm representing sort of my ancestral community, also my very real current community, I like the fact I'm tying that in with my service in the armed forces makes me feel, pretty honoured.
Just a few hundred Jewish personnel are believed to serve in the British Armed Forces now, but they serve behind a legacy that goes back centuries. Ali Gibson, Forces News, London.
Important to emphasise what we were seeing there. I think that was the senior Christian leadership of the military, the senior chaplains from the 3 main branches on the bimmer at the UK's oldest synagogue, inducting, using the Hebrew priestly prayer, may God bless you and keep you, to induct their Jewish counterparts into the chaplaincy so that they, the rabbis, can serve as chaplains not just to Jewish servicemen and women, but across all types of unit, and ensure that there is ministration across the religions for servicemen and women. The British military has very many problems, but anti-Semitism simply is not one of them. That said, when I first joined up, I didn't really get involved in the Jewish side of military life. Again, it wasn't because I had any discomfort with that. It was just simply that I really didn't have the time. There was already so much to think about and do, especially as a reservist when you've got your civilian career as well. But it was nice knowing that the Armed Forces Jewish community was there and they knew I was there, but I didn't really get too involved. A couple of things changed that though. The first was that we lost one of our own. Paul Mervis grew up in Wimbledon. His parents were his family members of the shul there. He was involved in the youth movements. He spent some time in Israel before university. He then trained as a journalist, but seeking more, went to Sandhurst to commission as an officer. He became a young lieutenant in the Rifles Regiment, Light Infantry. In June 2009, Paul led a patrol in Sangin district, Helmand province, Afghanistan, to secure a school which had been recently recaptured from the Taliban. Whilst establishing defensive positions on the roof, a booby-trapped improvised explosive device detonated. Paul was caught in the blast and, with the roof collapsing, fell through to the floor below. He died a few hours later of his injuries. May his memory be a blessing. At our annual Ample reunion in 2012, we were joined by Paul's family, friends, and some of his commanding officers, both at the time and previously, to dedicate a military Sefer Torah, originally from Catterick Garrison and part of the collection at Guildford Synagogue since the war, in his name. It was dressed in the rifles, in the colour of the Rifles Regiment, that bottle green, with an inscription to him embroidered upon it. Also presented that day was this military siddur from the Second World War. It had originally been carried across North Africa by the father of our then chairman, Colonel Martin Newman. Sergeant David Newman of the Green Jackets, a predecessor unit to the Rifles Regiment, had had it with him across the North African campaign during World War II, in which he had earned the Military Cross. When Paul deployed to Afghanistan, Martin had decided it was time to pass it on to another young Jewish light infantry soldier. It returned with Paul from Afghanistan and is now on permanent display at the Rifles Regiment Museum in Winchester. This mix of both Jewish and military mourning felt very natural, each half of that supporting the other. And it reminded me of something, an inkling of something I felt a couple of years before on a battlefield study tour with my unit to Nijmegen and Arnhem in the southeast Netherlands. In 1944, September 1944, these towns were the focus of Operation Market Garden, Field Marshal Montgomery's failed attempt to end the war by Christmas by crossing over the Rhine into the German industrial heartland of the Ruhr and making for Berlin. The Allies simply went a bridge too far. The failure, of course, immortalised in the book and film of the title depicting those 9 days. It was the Allies' biggest setback since D-Day. 2,000 casualties, the British Airborne Division itself taking 80% casualties. Nonetheless, the people of that region commemorate that attempted liberation for a week each year. And we were there to witness their appreciation of the veterans and of the British, Canadian, Polish and American airborne troops that had attempted so many decades before. At the Oostbeek Military Cemetery, we were able to perform our own acts of remembrance, and passing by the graves that had a Mogon David, I placed a stone on top and said a quick Kaddish. My colleagues asked me about the tradition. I explained it to them. They were still talking about it the next day on the journey home, expressing jealousy that their own confessional backgrounds didn't contain such a similar and simple but yet effective way of showing that you had paid your respects. Also in 2010, I started attending my own shul's remembrance Shabbat services. To stand in the synagogue in uniform, in the synagogue where I'd grown up, where my sister and I had been bar and bat mitzvahed, my parents had helped found, always feels like a small but sort of visual assertion of the Jewish connection to our communities, to our country, and yes, to Israel, but in stern defiance of the anti-Semitic slur of holding dual loyalty. During any remembrance service, whether it's in a shul, wherever it may be, the silence, the 2-minute silence, bisects 2 evocative and precise readings. The first is the extract from Lawrence Binion's World War I poem, The Fallen. They shall grow not old as we who are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. The going down of the sun, and in the morning we shall remember them. And then afterwards, the Kohima epitaph inscribed on the war memorial in the city of that name, where in 1944 the British Indian Army finally turned back the Japanese. When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today. These words invoke in me now an almost sort of a reflection, a reaction of sort of comfort and solemnity. Similar, I think, to those upon hearing the opening of the Mourner's Kaddish. I think they even have a similar cadence and rhythm. In the army, we're taught that, well, in Judaism, first of all, we're taught that there is one act of kindness that supersedes all others, that of looking after the dead, because they can't reciprocate it. In the army, we talk a lot about selfless commitment. In war, it means making sure that you put your mates, your unit, the mission, the country first. What does it mean in peacetime? Well, I think if we take it in the context of non-reciprocation, if we look at that Jewish direction of looking after the dead as the one true kindness, the chesed shel emet, we can say that remembrance should certainly be part of that as well. This overlap between Jewish mourning and military mourning, the peak of this is the annual Ajax parade. In 1934, George V gave permission for Ajax to march to the cenotaph on the Sunday after Remembrance Sunday in recognition of the Jewish contribution to the Great War. It remains a unique permission for any such group. And for those of us that I think have served, for those of us who still serve, for the families and friends of veterans, both with us and no longer with us, sadly, I think we can all say that it's such an incredible event and really some of our proudest moments in uniform to see so many people. It remains one of the biggest remembrance events of the throughout the country, not just for the Jewish community as well. And certainly for us, our times in uniform are those the most proudest ones are serving in the serving battalion and marching down Whitehall as a band from the Guards division plays Adon Olam as the chief rabbi's words of the Kiddush reverberate off the cenotaph itself. As much as I've come to sort of recognise the overlap between Jewish and military mourning, I've also come to see that there are myriad other ways in which army life reflects British life, reflects Jewish life. Indeed, I would say that in some respects, the British Army is the most Jewish organisation in the country. I'm particularly reminded of this of Remembrance season, which is like another set of High Holy Days, and particularly when the bugler plays Last Post and Ravelai, a simple tune on a simple instrument, rather mournful tones. Well, I think we all know who came up with that first. Food, important for us, very, very important in the army. We march on our stomach after all. As you go up through the ranks, there's no more important task each day than making sure that those under your command have eaten properly. My mother forcing another roast potato on me at Friday night dinner has nothing on my sergeant major making sure I finish my rations when we're on an exercise. And finally, where has the army spent most of the last decade and a half? In Iraq and Afghanistan, wandering around deserts for years on end, complaining about our leadership. Can't get more Jewish than that. When I first put this presentation together, this is where I intended to leave it. But there was something nagging at the back of my mind, something that the sort of serious business of remembrance aside, and the joking about the other stuff, there was something more universal, more permanent and structural about what it is we learn as Jews and try to do, and what it is we train for and execute as soldiers, sailors, airmen and women. So I went back to the beginning, to thinking about where it started for me in the Army Cadet Force, and in fact what had inspired me into that in the first place, my time in my Jewish youth movement. So I went back to the website to refamiliarise myself with RSY. On the About page I found the pillars of the movement, the principles under which I had, along with my friends, worked, played and learnt so many years before. First was Judaism. As I said, there is that connection through the military. In many ways, my military services has reconnected me with my Judaism. It strengthened my connection to it, and my Judaism has indeed made my military service even more meaningful. But that's a very personal thing. The second, Zionism. Always been a defender, supporter of Israel, but it's Britain to which I've made the ultimate commitment. And then the third, Tikkun Olam, repair of the world. That direction, that insistence from the Aleinu that we leave some part of this place in a better condition to how we found it. The military certainly doesn't get everything right, and our leaders certainly don't. I'm not going to sit here today and try and justify our failures to win the peace after winning the wars of this last 2 decades or so. But the paradox of military adventure, or even misadventure if you prefer, is that even when it goes wrong, even when we can perhaps be seen to be as bad as our enemies, the paradox is that the perfectly valid counterfactual analysis that non-intervention would have been just or even as bloody. And there are hundreds and thousands, if not millions of people around the world today living under various conflicts and regimes who we can check in with on that. But where, in 1999, at the height of the conflict in the Balkans, where the NATO was successful in defending the lives of tens of thousands of Kosovar Albanians, the international community tried to start putting together a new doctrine of the right to protect, a new way of answering the questions of how, when, why and where a country should intervene, or countries should intervene militarily in another's affairs. These questions were thrown into sharp relief by the events of 9/11, and they really dominated international affairs ever since. But where were these discussions first had in history? Where were these tensions first passed? Well, it's in the Talmud. In the Mishnah, the rabbis give us the difference between a milchemet mitzvah, a war of necessity, in which we must nonetheless sue for peace first, and a milchemet reshuv, a war of choice, in which we should seek the advice, the affirmation of 71 sages. We don't have 71 sages, an early Sanhedrin in our chain of command anymore. probably don't have 71 sages in the whole country. But what we do have is the law of armed conflict to guide us. The idea that war's worst aspects should be bounded, seen in things such as the Geneva Conventions and other international laws. But again, where do we first see these? Where do we first see such codification of the way that people should behave morally, or try to, in conflict? Well, again, this time it's in the Torah. It's here that we find ourselves talking about how to stop things like child brutality, looting, the maltreatment of non-combatants in conflict and in conflict zones. In Numbers, we get the laws for the laws of sieges, making sure that that those who want to leave a siege area can do so, and that natural resources are not damaged. We see these laws today. These are reflected as we speak in conflicts around the world, or in international communities' application of conflict around the world. Things such as the Geneva Protocols, and in the way that we treat humanitarian law and the rescue of refugees and everything else. In Deuteronomy, we find the laws about the sanctity of the military camp. Sanctity in both senses. In the physical sense, so that you will remain clean and healthy and able to fight, and in the spiritual sense as well, so that God will be on your side. These laws for sanctity in the military camp were taken and used to provide sanctity in the synagogues after the temple was destroyed. When you go and sit in shul, you are in some ways subjecting yourselves to the same discipline as an ancient Hebrew soldier defending some biblical patch of land millennia ago. These are the moral ways that armies can and should fight. But from where does a modern army draw its moral power? Well, one of those is operations other than war. There are 24 or so UN peacekeeping missions around the world. Britain is currently involved in about half a dozen of those. In our time in Afghanistan, one of our most audacious missions was to try and do the refurbishment of a hydroelectric dam in Kajaki, a very remote part of the country, to provide power for tens of thousands of people. Back home, the army, the military, is involved in the response to civil emergencies such as flooding, and has been deeply involved in the current response to coronavirus. Abroad, we are involved in medical emergencies as well, a detachment here deploying to deal with Ebola in West Africa. Also in Africa, we work with colleagues in places like Kenya and Ghana to stop illegal wildlife trafficking and poaching. In the Indian Ocean, we face down high seas piracy. In the Caribbean, the drugs trade. In the Mediterranean, the modern evils of human trafficking and modern slavery. Even if we're not involved in the conflict ourselves, we might be responsible for helping to evacuate non-combatants and civilians. And in natural disasters, it's very often the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force that are first in with help and aid and rescue. Helicopter here delivering during the Caribbean hurricanes back in 2016. Across the world, there are hundreds upon hundreds of aid and humanitarian projects. How many of these could not take place at all? Would not take place at all, were it not for the time and space and security afforded by men and women bearing arms. When it comes to untangling this knot of moral responsibility, of personal morality, fiscal responsibility, and military necessity, I find there's only one person to really turn to, George Orwell. 1945, in Notes on Nationalism, he wrote of pacifism, "Those who abjure violence can do so only because others are committing violence on their behalf." That is the stark truth that history, especially our history, has taught us. Ladies and gentlemen, the military exists to achieve and to maintain a monopoly of violence and to apply it in certain places at certain times. But when it is done by democracies, even flawed and imperfect democracies such as our own, it should mean that in those places and others, at that time and for the future, there is also defence, there is rescue, there is building, and there is repair. And that is why, for me, and I believe my Jewish comrades as well, in my life, my time in uniform has been the most consistent, the most persistent, and the most effective application of Tikkun Olam. Thank you very much.
Dan, thank you very much for a most interesting session there, starting with the far distant history. How pertinent it is to hear about Ajax and its role, particularly with Remembrance Sunday coming up this very Sunday. So very timely for us. I could have a number of questions myself, but I think I ought to open it up to other people. So if there are other people who would like to ask Dan a question, please put your microphone on and identify yourself.
Yes, my name is Shlomo Kreiman. I haven't actually seen you, Mr. Fox. You seem to not have appeared on my screen.
I'm here now.
Are you? Jolly D. I'm sure we'll see you in a minute. You mentioned the service in 2018 at Bevis Marks. I was actually privileged to get a ticket to that through, shall we say, connections. And it was, in fact, the most elating evening. Were you there?
Yes, absolutely. I was. I was at the back. The point at which the Sifrei Torah were marched down the double aisles. I was giving the marching commands for that. So you would have heard my voice if you didn't see me. Right.
What was interesting was that, just to make a connection, you mentioned Mordent Cohen, who I know from family connections, and of course Simon Taylor, who was one of the chaplains inducted, is his grandson.
Great nephew, but yes.
Oh, great nephew. I beg your pardon. Yep. Right, great nephew. Oh, yes, of course, yes. The whole thing was done beautifully. It really was.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shlomo. Anybody else got a question?
Yes, I have actually.
Go on then.
Hi. Thank you very, very much, Dan. It was very informative, extremely interesting. I just wondered, how much does your volunteering encroach into people's careers? And are there ever any companies or organisations that don't allow this?
So it very much depends employer to employer. I'm lucky. I work as a civil servant, so actually the civil service gives me extra holiday to do my reserve duty. Some other employers do as well. Some of the bigger sort of firms in places like the city and things like that. But otherwise, yeah, you do have to take it out of your own holiday time, which obviously puts pressure on other time off with family or for yourself or whatever it may be. I'm not aware of any organisations or employers that stop people becoming reservists. There are certainly those that can put forward exemptions to being mobilised. So in order to make sure that you're not absent for long periods of time, like when I went to Afghanistan for 6 months, some employers can ask for you to be exempted from mobilisation, but your normal year-to-year, week-to-week, month-to-month service can still continue.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Dan, can I just ask, if you like, your experience at Camp Bastion? I mean, everything we read about that it was a horrendous place to be out there at all times. As going out there as a reservist, did you feel particularly vulnerable, or were you just integrated as part of the normal force that was working out there?
Yeah, so I mean, I went out as a member of the regular army. I was mobilised from the reserves. There were tens of 10,000, I think, reservists served in Afghanistan. We were integrated for our time out there into regular forces. There was no distinction once you were there, and indeed for many weeks and months beforehand. In terms of what it was like, at the time it was pretty basic. Extreme weather, safe though. It was a base. It was guarded. I actually went back in a civilian role many times a couple of years later, at the point at which it was at its peak, where it was the size of Reading and almost a little town. And shortly after that, when we started withdrawing, seeing it reduce back down again to a small camp. So people's of Camp Bastion in particular, people's experiences will differ depending on when they went out there, from 2006 when it was established until 2014 when it was finally dragged down.
Can I give you hello?
Yes, go on, carry on.
Can I speak? Hello there.
Go on, carry on.
Me? Oh.
Yeah.
Can I just refer? Can you hear me?
Yes,
I can.
Carry on.
Yes. When you showed some pictures of an army veteran who fell in Korea by the name of Ritterband, and I have a memory of my late husband when he was in national service in the Royal Army Dental Corps in Korea, coming across a Jewish cemetery and seeing the grave with the Magen David and the name Ritterband, took a picture of that grave and contacted the family. He didn't get much response, but it's strange that you should show Ritterband, which was the one he took the picture of. Thank you. Wonderful talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And I just point out at this juncture that Danny Ritterband, Maurice Ritterband's brother, served in the Chindits in Burma, and Maurice Ritterband got killed at quite a young age, unfortunately. But I did know of Maurice Ritterband, and I worked together with Danny Ritterband, his elder brother.
Okay.
Thank you.
Also, there's one other point. I did national service in Malaya in 1951 to 53. Would you know in detail if there are any Jewish ex-servicemen left who fought in the Malayan campaign? Have you got?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm sure there must be. It's not a particular operation I've looked into, but I should probably add that to the list. I'll pass that back to Ajax and see what I can get for you.
There were quite a few of us out there, actually.
I bet.
And what's happening with the Ajax parade this year? Obviously, it'll be greatly reduced, but what is the plan?
Well, so a couple of weeks ago, about 20 of us went to film a service around the cenotaph. That service will be broadcast at 2:30 on the 15th of November. The details are on the Ajax website. And there'll be 3 of us there actually on the day now, but just 3 of us to lay a wreath on the 15th of November. There's essentially no parade. There's no national parade. The Royal British Legion National Parade on Remembrance Sunday is not happening at all. So unfortunately this year, hopefully it'll be for the last time, but everything is much reduced. So if you're looking to attend Ajax, the best way to do it is via the website, via the broadcast that will take place on the 15th of November. There's also an online Ajax Remembrance Shabbat on the 14th.
Okay, thank you. Couple more questions for Dan before we let him go.
Got a question.
Go on then.
It's Rita Hammerman here. So obviously you're a young lad. Anyway, thank you very much first of all for an interesting talk. You're a young lad. How old can you go on to doing what you're doing now?
So the official sort of a retirement age in the reserves is 55. You can get extensions up to 60.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Dan, can I ask a question? It's Jeffrey Zemmel.
Hi, Jeff.
Hi. I want you to picture this. I'm 21 years old. I'm Jewish. That wasn't funny, Stuart, please. I'm 21 years old.
You're painting a picture here. I'm sorry.
Dan, I'm 21 years old. I'm a graduate. I've got a good degree. And I come to you and I say, I'm contemplating a career in the army. What would be your advice?
So my advice would be to find a reserve unit in an area of the army that you're interested in. So there's obviously lots of different skills and talents that you can bring. lots of learning and your own training. So if you're very gung-ho and adventurous, then there's the infantry units. If you're interested in the technical side of things, there's the Royal Engineers and the Royal Signals. There's units that deal with languages. There's lots of different options, lots of different career options in the army, and that's reflected in the reserves as well. So I would urge somebody first and foremost to find a reserve unit you're interested in and join them. And if you find out that army life is for you, then you can transfer into the regulars, especially at that age. But try it out first. Try it out first and see if you enjoy it.
Okay, thank you. One more for Dan. Anybody else? No. Dan, is the Jewish Veterans Group still going? Bear in mind, or is it all assimilated now into Ajax? I presume you know that there aren't many people left from Second World War in terms of veterans these days.
Sure. I mean, they're of course fewer and fewer with us every year, sadly. Ajax itself is becoming a much more cradle-to-grave organisation, not just for veterans, but for those that are serving, the recently served, and all their families as well. Which again just reflects the changing nature of, I think, both the Jewish community and the Armed Forces Jewish community.
Okay, right. Any more questions? No? Okay. Dan, thank you so much for an interesting afternoon. It's been very informative, as I say, very timely as well. We're very grateful for you giving up your time, and please give our regards to Louis as well, and perhaps we'll see him another day.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
No, thank you.
So, it's just here. Thank you so much.
Can I just again remind you about next week's session with our two rabbis? Please let us have some questions beforehand so we can give them some real challenges. Again, the email address is bushysage@gmail.com. We look forward to hearing from you and look forward to seeing you next Tuesday. But don't forget Thursday. Don't forget, for current affairs on Thursday, another session for you. Same time, same place. See you then. Thanks. Bye.